Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah, and if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that will allow you to keep coming back for more great content. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I welcome you back, and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So, before we get into today's conversation, which I am just thoroughly excited about, just a few housekeeping items to take care of, as we always do. Please make sure you hit the red subscribe button if you're watching from YouTube. It'll be under my name, Sarfo-Mensah. But this is the official Identity Talk channel where you'll find content from the platform, as well as getting notifications on future episodes of this podcast and our newest podcast, Radical Math Talk. Also, if you would like to help us build this platform and continue to bring these brilliant minds onto this platform, we do accept monetary donations that will help us continue to do the work that we're doing in the education space. If you're on Cash App, see, I always mix those two up. You can use the handle $IDTALK4ED. And if you have Venmo, the handle would be at KwameSM. That's KWAMESM. Thank you so much. Now, today's conversation is one that I think is vital given the times that we're in our education space. On this podcast, we talk so much about the role that teachers play, obviously, in this space. Principals play in this space, superintendents and other professionals within the space. But we don't talk enough about the role that parents play and how they can contribute into pushing change in our systems. And today's guest is somebody who is just phenomenal. I've been following her work for a while. She started out as an educator. She still is an educator, but she's doing it in a way that is transformative, and it's really pushing us to think critically about how we're raising our children, not just as educators, but more importantly as parents. As someone who was raised by my mom and just seeing the trials and tribulations she went through, and now being a father, this is something that is an important topic for me to cover, but I feel like it's important for a lot of us to cover who are parents, who are raising Black and brown children in this racially charged climate. So without further ado, I want to bring on a special guest. Many of you probably familiar with her work because she's out there. Britt Hawthorne. She's coming on to the podcast to talk with us about her new book about raising anti-racist children and what we can do as parents to push this work forward. So let's bring Britt on for this conversation. Hello, hello. Oh, I think you're on mute.
You would think that after all of this practice we've all had, like we would get the hang of it. But hey,
it's all good.
Thanks, Kwame. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm excited and honored to be in community with you.
Same here. It's an honor to have you on this platform, and there's so much that I can talk to you about, and I know that we have an hour, but we're going to definitely cram as much as we can in this time that we have, because I feel like there are so many things going on in our education space, and for certain topics, we would need an entire episode to just unpack some of these different things. But before we get into the deep skinny of all that, one thing that I always want to have my guests do is to just share how they came to education. And you took a very unique path into getting into space. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to just share briefly your story, which I know you've shared many times on different platforms. But for those who don't know who you are, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you into this education space.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking and opening the conversation up in really such a personal way. I think is really beautiful. And so I'm a second generation teacher. So I feel like I've been in education my entire life. My mom was an educator. She was a principal. She was a professor. And she had a love for literacy. And so there isn't a time that I've never not really been in the field of education. When I was a young child, I remember my mom used to teach teachers about reading, teachers that were going back and becoming reading specialists. And so oftentimes I was the child behind the class. And teachers would practice, their different reading strategies with me. And I remember one time I had corrected a teacher and it was like, no, actually, you're supposed to do it this way. And my mom was like, did you want your fruit roll up or not? And I was like, okay, I'm going to act like I don't know how to read. I forgot. And so, yeah, I remember helping her set up her classroom, even when I was really, really young. I'm originally from Illinois, where we have basements, unlike here in Houston. And in my basement, I had these folding tables set up and I had all of these stuffed animals on them. And my parents would pretend to come and check their child in and out. And I had these file folders and let them give a little report on their child for the day. And so I always knew I wanted to be a teacher and have done various jobs in the field of education, whether that was working at the Boys and Girls Club and being the education director, or teaching and coaching gymnastics, or being a paraprofessional for autistic children. And then, eventually went to college, had my undergrad degree in elementary education with a whole bunch of endorsements. I know a lot of folks can relate to that long list of endorsements. And then through my children, I found Montessori. We had a local public Montessori school and their lottery opened up and I overheard some parents talking about it. And I said, oh, that sounds super posh. I wonder what that is. I never heard of Montessori before. Went, did an observation. Our oldest child name came up the lottery. He literally won the lottery and got accepted into the school. And from there, I fell in love with Montessori, became a Montessori educator until eventually being pushed out of the classroom, homeschooling. And now this was our last year homeschooling and our children are back in school. So yeah, I've the story just kind of keeps bobbing and weaving and I just kind of keep bobbing and weaving with it.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And just for context, I have two nieces who went through the Montessori school when they're in kindergarten. So during those formative years, but now they're in public schools. So I can
Like a
attest,
traditional
yeah,
setting.
more traditional. So I can attest to just how powerful Montessori schools are in terms of just the style. If anything, it's the antithesis of what our traditional education system is, where it's like, okay, we're just going to have these students for 1 year. It doesn't matter if they're ready to move on. We're just going to move them on because we don't want to have any overpopulation within the different grades. So it's going to keep pushing them along. Whereas with the Montessori model, as you already know, is very tactile.
Mm-hmm.
The pacing is dictated by the student's development.
Mm-hmm.
And you could be with that same teacher for 2 to 3 years, So I just love the fact that it is informed by the students.
Mm-hmm.
And the students just have more agency in that space to say, you know what, I'm not ready. Let's stay here for a moment so we can really continue to build on what we're trying to learn here.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful pedagogy and there's lots of different kind of I work now with a ton of Montessori schools. And so there's lots of variations that I will see across the country, whether the school is in a private setting or a nonprofit setting, or if the school is a public Montessori, in which I've taught in public Montessori. There's kind of different variations, but to your point, there's some foundations that always will bind schools together. And the biggest one is that we follow the child. And, we have that phrase that's in our pedagogy, but it definitely rings out in the way in which we're very responsive to the child and their needs.
And thinking about how many of our traditional schools are, especially when you consider high stakes testing, right? Do you feel like the Montessori philosophy comes in direct conflict with that? Because so much of Montessori is about the pacing of the child and the child letting us know that, hey, I need a little bit more time with this skill. But we're in these time constructs where, okay, we have this pacing guide, we have a scope of sequence, we got to get through this within a week. But you may be in an inclusive classroom where you have students with IEPs. You might have some emergent bilingual students. You may have some students with 504 plans. You can't just do the same plan for everybody else. So I'm just wondering, how does that conflict?
Yeah, I mean, it is like the conflict is real. And so in Montessori, it's a direct conflict. And if folks have taught public Montessori like myself, that means not only are we trying to uphold the Montessori pedagogy, but we are still held the same standard as everyone else. And so our students still take all of the same district testing, state testing that's mandated. And so, but I think that teaching in general, whether you teach in a traditional setting, whether you teach with a Reggio philosophy or a Waldorf philosophy or a Montessori philosophy, I think that all of those are in direct conflict with high stakes testing. And like we see, and right now it's happening, and our youngest child is in school really, truly for the first time. I mean, he's in 3rd grade and we've already talked to him. We are opt-outer. So even when I taught in public school, I opt my children out. And so we've also continued just that we will opt out of high stakes testing at the elementary level. And so having those conversations with him of like, why are we opting out? And like, what is that kind of direct action meaning and how we're aligning our values with our actions? And so, especially being a parent, it's different as a teacher if you want to opt out as a teacher. And I have teacher friends who have opted out from administering or proctoring the test. And that looks different depending on where you teach and how you teach in your relationship with administrators. But as parents, right, we do have that say if we want our child to take that test. And for us as caregivers, my partner and I, we have said, particularly elementary level, it is in direct conflict with all best practices, regardless of your pedagogy. It's just in conflict. It's not developmentally appropriate in any way to take a high stakes test and to have, not only do they have to sit for so long to take the test, but then they have to sit not just however long it takes them, but however long it takes the entire school to finish the test. And like, when is that ever applicable in life? Like, when am I ever waiting on the rest of, 550 students to finish or 550 adults to finish something? And it's stalling my growth. And the point of us being in school is to learn.
I mean, that's ultimately the goal is for us to learn. And speaking of learning, I know that, you are biracial. So you have that as part of your identity. And I'm interested in knowing, as someone who has 2 parents who are coming from the same country, grew up in the same culture, how did that shape your worldview as a Black woman? And how does that inform the work that you do?
Yeah, so it's interesting, any solid anti-bias, anti-racist framework is always going to start, or one of the first 2 steps are always going to be identity.
Yes.
Always, right? Because our identity is not only the way that we experience the world, but the way the world experiences us.
Yes.
And that really, we think that we see the world the way that the world is, but we really just experience the world the way the world experiences us. And there's like always kind of in tandem. So being Black biracial is definitely mean the way that people experience me and how I experience them. And for me, it started, I would say, probably when it starts for a lot of folks, upper elementary to middle school, is really when like there's this huge identity formation where you start to get language and you start to understand, I am a person, a part of a larger community, right? Like my city is larger than what I thought it was. My state is a lot larger than what I thought it was. And actually it was through high stakes testing. When you have to fill out those bubbles, now they will either have them pre-filled or students fill it at the end. But back in the day, right before you even took the test, you used to have to like fill in your name, right? So like I'm like B-R-I, and you would have to do that for your racial identity as well. And back in the 90s, we didn't have, the US didn't collect data on biracial, multiracial, racial groups.
Right.
And so I remember asking my mom, like, what do I mark? I'm not represented on here. My mom's like, you'll mark black. And I'm like, but you're white. And she's like, I am. And you're black. Like you are a black girl with a white mom. And so for me, I was self-identified by my parents. I didn't self-identify. And so there's like a lot of conversation around, do we allow children to self-identify and not? But for me in the 90s, my parents definitely were like, you are a black girl and you have a white mom and you have a black dad. They never cared for the language mixed, which was really big at that time too. And I think it still hangs around. Whenever I would tell my mom like, oh yeah, they called me the mixed girl. My mom was like, that is cake batter. Like you are not mixed. Like that's not a thing. Right. They didn't really subscribe to that. We also didn't really subscribe to the whole like being half black, half white either, like kind of all of that language that's either about a melting pot idea or about a separation idea. My parents didn't really subscribe to too much. But I mean, my mom, she listened to Cornell West. We had like so many books about being black. I think they did the best. Both my parents did the best that they could. They were both super race conscious. I don't think a day went by where we never talked about race. I don't think, though, I had the skills to talk about and identify racism in a way that I wanted to. But we definitely talked about race both as a racial identity, but we also talked about cultural identity, like things that are different culturally among people. And whether there's an overlap, my mom is from the South. And so there can be a lot of overlap with Southern white folks in the way that like we eat food. Like a pot of pinto beans and collard greens is definitely Southern food. And then there's like styles to make that food. And then there's just like not overlap. Like for my mom's side of the family, macaroni and cheese is a whole meal. My dad's side of the family, it is very clear it is a side dish. You know what I mean? And it's like the same with spaghetti. So there's like, there can be overlap depending on geographically where you exist. And then there's not some overlap. But yeah, like I think that because I grew up also with both sides of the family celebrating all of our holidays, family get-togethers, I intimately saw and experienced whiteness in a way that I can both understand it, in a way that I can have language for it, and a way in which I can navigate that offers me a steep amount of immunity and privilege, even though I'm not white. And I've also experienced my dad's side of the family, and same thing, that I can navigate and be cautious, and I can be in reality. Right. And so for us, like ignorance has never been this idea of protection.
Right.
That like white families will say, you know what, I just want to wait to have the conversation. And as an educator, I'm like, when has ignorance ever protected anyone? Like that doesn't even make any sense, right? It's always being able to identify a situation, have language for that situation, to be able to discuss, have safe people you can discuss with. Mm-hmm. That has always offered us protection. Right. And so now I think like I have all of those building blocks, and now I'm really coming into this stage of, well, what are the skills that I need? And what are the skills my children need in order to dismantle racism?
And if you don't mind me asking, your mom, what state was she from in the South?
Missouri.
Missouri? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
So she was born and spent most of her life in West Plains, Missouri. So super rural, and oftentimes forgotten Southern, but deeply Southern state.
All right. So I'm asking this because I'm just wondering, you mentioned the fact that even though your parents talked to you a lot about your racial and cultural identities, right? You still didn't have the words or the skills to be able to articulate issues of racism. And it's making me circle back to what you were talking about with regard to developmentally appropriateness. Because so often when we talk about anti-racism, when we talk about just race in general, there's this rhetoric that, oh, they're too young to know about what's going on, here. They're too young to know about racism. They're too young to know about, what discrimination looks like. They're too young to know about these things. But clearly that's not the case. And there are a lot of people who are pretty much debunking that theory. So I'm wondering, do you believe that your mom or even your dad or even both of your parents felt like, maybe we shouldn't let Britt know right now what really goes down in our society. Let's wait until she gets a little older. Did you ever, do you believe that?
No,
Or
I
no?
don't ever think that they held back. I think that neither one of my parents had the skills.
Got it.
I think that both of them, and my mom, for her time and the work that she did, obviously from where she grew up to having a relationship with my dad, and they were married for 27 years before she passed away. And, I think they've did a lot of really good work. And it's this idea that us, by talking about race, I think it's a misconception. We think that we're talking about race, that we're also talking about racism. But oftentimes people are really just talking about race. They're just noticing differences, right? And so talking about race is being able to notice particular phenotypes in people, whether that's their hair texture or their eye shape or their nose, or it can be their skin color. Talking about race might be talking about where geographically we have connections to ancestors and where our ancestors exist from. And then talking about racism, though, is talking about the system of advantage, where white people are advantaged and people of color, people of the global majority, are disadvantaged. And then being able to identify, well, where does all of that exist? And so growing up, I think my parents, where they stopped in their journey is being able to, they could identify racism, and that racism oftentimes existed in an interpersonal level. So this one person, like I remember one time I went to the store with my dad. It was me, I have two sisters who were a little older than me. We were at the store and we were so clearly being followed by a cis white man store manager who was following us.
Sure.
And so I immediately thought I must have done something wrong, right? Because I also grew up with a lot of ideas around morality and, you want to be a good girl, you want to be a good person. And so immediately I thought, maybe I didn't say hi to someone, or maybe I'm being too loud, maybe it just was like one of those kind of unspoken grace and courtesy things that I did. And so, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to get in trouble. And eventually my dad just goes like right up to him and was like, I need you to stop following me. I'm not going to steal anything. And you're being racist. And the store manager just kind of was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I vividly remember, I knew I was like a fish out of water. I didn't now understand what I was experiencing.
Right.
So in that moment, the way that I coded it before my dad named it, I internalized that I did something wrong and I don't know what it was, but I must be wrong and I must try to do something to do better. So when we got into the car and we talked about it, my dad was like, you know what? I'm not buying anything here. Take it all back. We get in the car and you talk about it, my dad was like, that was racism. But that's the only kind of racism we ever talked about, was when like one person commits an act against another person.
So y'all didn't get into the systems, like how systems perpetuate racism. It was more of like individual, interpersonal level.
Because at the same time, my parents also deeply believed in meritocracy. This idea that like if you just work really hard, Yeah. Like you work hard and
Yep.
like that we're going to make it. It's
Yep.
interesting now that my dad has made a 180 and he's never stopped growing. So now like he has systems thinking and language. But yeah, back then when I was a little girl, we didn't. So I don't, thinking about those kind of skills, I didn't have. I did. And so then when I became an educator, I practiced a lot of white saviorism, right? This idea that like, if we all just try really hard and that like, I'm a really great teacher, I'm a good, because there's that morality, I'm a good teacher doing good work with these good students. And so then we will yield what? Good results. And this like so much just idea and language around goodness, individualism, saviorism, that like, if we really think the problem was that we just haven't had a good number of good teachers, that like that's been the problem, is very naive on my part. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit.
Yeah, and that's deep. And just speaking on the whole paternalism piece, which in the form of white saviorism, I mean, these are things that we come into the field with, these ideologies, because we grew up in a K-12 system where I know in my case, a lot of my teachers were white and they were doing a lot of these same behaviors that I
Mm-hmm.
just inherited. And I thought, well, to be a teacher is to work 50, 60 hours a week. So we talk about the whole perfectionism piece, the
Yep.
grind culture, let's just keep on pushing,
Mm-hmm.
because it ties back to meritocracy. If I put the hours in, I'm going to show my colleagues, my administrators, and all others that I'm invested in the school
Mm-hmm.
and what we're trying to do. And then over time, you start to realize it doesn't matter how hard you work, you're still expendable.
Yes.
So, I mean, I
And the
found yeah,
system has never been created for success.
nope.
For you know what I mean? It's never been created for both the teachers and the learners to actually have success. And so that's a whole nother thing, when I like took a break from the school system and I had to take a step back, because to your point, not only was I educated in the system, but then I had a mom who was an educator, and then I went directly into the system, and my undergrad degree was from a very traditional program, which is also having conversations that when I think back on, I was like, why were we even talking about that? I remember them talking about like the way that we need to dress as a teacher. And then
Oh,
like,
really?
yes, like, and
Oh, wow.
practicing and like talking about like how you need to have shirts that, come up to your neck, and like, that you just basically need to be fully clothed and act like you don't have a body or a shape at all. And even I remember we had this principal one time, we got a new principal who had been a teacher for a number of years. It's our first time becoming a principal. And the school I was working at, we were pretty casual when we dressed. A lot of cargo pants, khakis, Birkenstocks. But this was a Montessori school, and anybody's been in a Montessori school, then you know that we only have enough tables for a third of our class. Everybody else, we do work on the floor. So you're constantly on the floor doing work. And then nature is a big part of it. So oftentimes we're out in nature, we go on silent nature walks. Anyways, we have this principal that comes in, and one thing she wanted to change right away, she wanted to create a dress code. And she wanted everyone to wear business casual. And then on Fridays, we get to earn jeans. Like Fridays was like a jean day. I was like, why do I have to earn wearing jeans?
Wait, that
Like
was an
how,
incentive?
yes. And it was like, and how are we even coding jeans as being professional or not? So anyways, we had a lot of pushback, and it was like, we kept asking her why. And she said, we worked at the time, the schools had a large number of Black students. And she goes, we might be the only people that are in their lives that show them what professionals dress like. And it just was like, to your point, the paternalism, the disconnection. I'm like, you clearly have no relationship with your students, because I know not all, but a lot of these students go to a Baptist church on Sunday,
Right.
and they could probably teach us a thing or two about how to dress. Like, and no, that was just, again, it was like this idea Like I'm the only one that's like giving the child love or giving them a hug, or that I need to buy them supplies, right? Sometimes it's just being transparent with families and being like, hey, I just want to be open and honest and name the fact that this is what the school provides. Here's really what the students, the learners need in order to have all of the resources available. I'm wondering if anyone can donate this kind of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like all about partnership, not I'm going to go out and spend my first paycheck all on supplies. And then these children need to be thankful. And so should their families, which creates resentment. And also not this school supplies list where I just tell you you're going to buy it. And there's no kind of collaborative conversation of like, why am I buying it? And why do you need 25? Like we have to acknowledge that people who are not in the education field don't know what it means to be an educator. If I go to my doctor's office and then they tell me I have to buy the supplies in order to get service, I'm also going to be like, what the hell? Are you kidding me? There's a disconnect.
Right.
But if someone was like, well, you could rely on what the county provides, or if you have the ability to donate, you actually will yield better results. I might be like, you know what? I think I could do that. And I become more vested. But like that whole idea of partnership is so, I feel like, disconnected, but is so vital in order for anti-bias, anti-racism to exist, right? It's so vital for liberation to exist, is that we have to have community partnerships. And what does that mean for me to holistically collaborate with another human being?
And I think staying on that, when we talk about community partnerships, I feel like with certain partnerships, they're embedded in this cloth of interest convergence where, okay, I'm going to partner with you because I know that in the end, there's going to be an incentive for me. And this is the case when we talk about allyship versus, being a co-conspirator, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have certain white folks who come in and it's like, yeah, like we're down for the cause. But then you wonder, well, why are you down for the cause? Right? What is your personal mission in this movement? And also, if there was nothing in the bag for you, would you still be down with this cause?
Mm-hmm.
And we see it so often in our school system, particularly the way that Black and brown educators are tokenized in order to push teacher diversity initiatives. I mean, that's just been going on for quite a while.
Yep.
But there are a lot of examples out there. But I want to ask you about just your thoughts on prescriptions. Like, you are an anti-racist educator. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the work that you do as an anti-racist educator is to provide individuals who need support in this work, regardless of where they are on the spectrum, whether they're in the infant stages of their journey or further along that spectrum. But the reason why you do what you do, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is because you want to try to get more folks to join in this movement. You don't want to be the one trying to do it alone. And it's going back to what you said about community partnership, being able to have a collective.
I'm gonna shift it just a little bit.
Yes, please.
Ready? So I do this work because I know that I'm not alone in doing this work. And that I actually came into this work not because, again, I was raised this way or that I had this skill set, right? These are a set of skills that I've had to develop over time through perseverance and commitment. But as I'm like developing these skills, it's actually when I moved to Texas, I felt really isolated. I'm like, I know I'm not the only one. I just have to find my people.
Yes.
And so there's a great book just came out by Andre Henry. Let me see if I want to say the title of the book is To All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. It's somewhere behind me because I just put it on my bookshelf, but it's by Andre Henry. And he cites this study that a lot of anti-racist folks that we cite. And the fact is that it only takes 3.5% of a population for a social movement to happen. I do that work to find the 3.5% of people. I'm really not interested in anyone who is also not interested in this work. I leave them where they are, right? It's the folks that are saying, hey, values are aligned. I'm also committed in helping children, because my work is really niche. It's in particular for children, whether they're learners in our classroom or learners at home. But it's how do I help a child to become an empathetic, critical thinker who embraces compassion and justice, right? Like those are the values. And so when I find my people, I'm like, how do we then collectivize to move this work forward? I only kind of wanted to shift that a little bit because I just had a conversation with someone yesterday.
Okay.
And they had said, and I was like, you know what? I need to say this. So I'm saying it to you on your podcast so that I can just like go back and be like, you know what? I talked about it on Kwame's podcast.
There you go.
Is this idea that we want to try to get everybody on the same boat, or we want to try to get everyone on the same page, or how do I get the most resistant person committed to this work? You don't. And if that's your focus, you've lost sight. You're in the weeds, get out of the weeds, right? Our focus is first and foremost on learners. How do I help a learner to become a critical thinker that's centering justice? And then how do I find my people who are already aligned in my values? Because I know it only takes what percent? 3.5. And then once you start to remember that, that's like, wait a minute, out of this entire group, out of all of my colleagues at this school, I only need 3.5% of y'all. Oh, wait a minute. Like we can really start to go deep. And by going deep, the work then will become wide, right?
There you go.
But it's this idea like we want to have a PD and try to get all 80 people on the same page. We haven't even got all 80 people to decide what we're going to have on Thursday's potluck. How are we supposed to get all 80 people to get on the same page about ABAR? Right? It's like, it's not going to happen. So I kind of just want to shift it for really the listeners that are listening that may have had that question of how do I try to convince, the fourth grade team, or how do I convince that your work is not to try to convince people. It's to try to find your people and collectivize.
And that's key. I mean, the nature of anti-bias, anti-racist work is about community. It's all about that. And if we exert so much energy trying to convince resistant folks that what we're saying is the truth, we're just going to fall into racial battle fatigue, right? Yes. We're going to fall into that. And this leads me to my question about just the work that you do as an anti-racist educator and activist. How do you establish a balance between providing the prescriptions, whether they're in the form of the podcast, whether they're in the form of, the different guides and the scaffolds that you provide to parents, to educators, but then still have the sanity and to still have the health to sustain in this work? Mm-hmm. How are you able to establish that balance, or is that still a work in progress? I know that is for me.
I think I'm at a really good balance, I have to say. I have done a lot of work, both personal development around boundaries, around what are my expectations for how I want people to engage with me, and then what are my expectations of how I'll engage with other people. I've done a lot of work around how to say no in ways that feel right for me. I tend to be a bit more gracious with my no. So I have 7 different ways that I can say no that feel right for me. But that's maintaining a boundary. And then if it's not clear enough, I will just absolutely say, I want to repeat, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to say no, but this is a firm no, thank you. Right. So I have done a lot of work around that. I'm also really clear about what I do and who I do it with and who I do it for. Right. So I do it for myself. I don't do that. I don't do the work for anyone else. I really do this work for myself. because the more that I do this work, I'm finding my more liberated self. And I do this work with other adults because the children, especially this generation, they are stepping into their power.
Yes.
And like they are doing it, right? It's us that are still hold an immense amount of power of creating policies and procedures and rules and laws. And we keep saying like, oh, just wait for that next generation while we're still maintaining power. And so it's important that I do this work with other adults, really as an act of service. And then how I do my work is also very, very clear and apparent to me, in the ways in what services that I offer. I also am really clear that white supremacy characteristic of, being the only one, this idea, I'm the only one doing this work, whether that can be an anti-racism or something else, right? You're on the PTO board or you're on a church group leadership or something, and you're like, gosh, I'm the only one. Anytime I say that, I'm always like, wait a minute, I am not the only one. And if I'm out of line with my bounds, if I am taking on more work than everyone else, I just name that. And so I'm really good about naming it. And then the other part that's useful for me is that I approach this work with immense amount of curiosity and playfulness. Something that I don't oftentimes find in this work, but I think about anti-bias, anti-racism can be full of really critical conversations, very fraught conversations, have a ugly and dark history. Liberation should be us that we're still working to discover. Liberation work is about finding joy. And so I try to balance those both in my personal life, but also in my professional life. Everyone has the right to experience joy. And I want to make sure that after doing this work, the way that I stay engaged with it the most is that if I'm traveling, I love to travel, I'm experiencing joy by traveling, but I'm also being committed to like when I go into another community, how am I supporting folks that are that community? Like, how am I thinking about redistributing resources or funds to go into that community? And who am I accountable to when I go into a community? So it's like, yeah, I'm out, I'm traveling, I'm having a good time, I'm taking a selfie on the beach, and I'm also being really conscious and critical of the ways in which I'm existing and taking up space in a community that's not mine.
Mm. And those are all important things that we all should be doing, is just establishing those boundaries, because the work itself is overwhelming, it's taxing, and we're just not going to solve these problems in one day. I mean, this is lifelong work.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
lifelong work.
And it's a practice, like anything that we really enjoy, whether it's yoga or baking bread or learning to knit, like those are all practices, right? And so is ABAR. It's a practice, it's lifelong work, which is why you need to have a community you enjoy being with. And that doesn't mean that everybody's going to like everyone. I know, shocking, right? Sometimes you're not going to like people in your community, but you're aligned in values. So you're like, okay, I still really respect them. But like, they're really not my people that I want to go and hang out with and like have brunch with. But like, I respect them. And so I'm going to stay in community with them because I know that they are an indispensable person to this community, just as I am. But yeah, I think starting off in teaching, I had no boundaries. It was so pathetic. Like, and that's where the resentment and the burnout really, for me, it really started to fester, was because I didn't have boundaries. I didn't know how to tell administrators no. I didn't know how to tell coworkers no. And I most certainly, because I was so afraid of parents, I most certainly did not know how to tell parents, no, thank you.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I just thought that I had to be there, that I had to do these different things, because in the end, my mindset was, if I don't do this, the perception will be that I don't care about this school community, that I don't care about students. So it was like a guilt trip for me. So I was always like, yeah, definitely. I'm there.
I
You
know,
need me
I'm
to
on
see?
every committee. But even like I think about even when it would be like a birthday celebration, and I had really clear expectations for how we would go about celebrating birthdays. Both because it was the school expectation, but I also had 2 students in my classroom who were Jehovah's Witnesses. And so I really wanted to also honor their family's expectation. And so I just had a particular way. But I remember one time, mom had showed up, and this was a mom who was the non-custodial parent. And so I didn't often hear from her or see her because she didn't have full custody of her daughter. And so like she showed up at like 9 a.m. with like a bouquet full of balloons and cake and ice cream as if her child's birthday party was about to happen at 9 a.m. in my classroom. And I remember being so upset on the inside, but on the outside, I was like, let's cut cake. And then she handed me the cake and then what and served. And I was, does this look like peaches? What? Like we're in the middle of our math. But I didn't know how to maintain my boundaries and say, I am so excited. I am so unbelievably excited to celebrate your daughter's birthday with you today at 3:30. So I can't wait to see you today at 3:30. We're going to finish math. We have library. And if you want to hang out with us today, you can. And the balloons and cake can hang out in the teacher's lounge. That's welcome because we also had like an open door policy.
Sure.
But I didn't know at that. So then and I remember a teacher walking by and she was like, looking through my and I was like, and instead of me being like, I know, I needed to restate my expectation and also acknowledge that maybe the parent didn't know. Maybe they didn't get my classroom handbook at the beginning of the year, right? I don't know all of the background information. But yeah,
Right.
even when it's just like something that's really fun like that.
Yeah. And it's the heat of the moment. So of course you're not taking the time to fully process all these different things or considering these different factors. So I mean,
Yes.
you can't
Oh,
beat up on yourself that much.
it was like a lot of, because I didn't have the tools and the practice of how to advocate for
Right.
myself, right? So whenever that would happen, like a lot of brain fog would happen and it would show up in my body, like, right, my stomach starts to kind of like twist and turn, or my heart would race. And it's like, I just can't process. But because I'm developing my skills in liberation work and anti-racist work, I'm able to code when that happens in my body a lot better and be like, okay, let me take a deep breath because something about me is just, it's giving me discomfort. It's not sitting right. Hang on. And like just even being able to like vulnerably share that with the other person. And it gives them permission that they can vulnerably share then with me, right? And it's like, yeah, actually, I thought about it. This isn't the best time. And this is
Okay.
why. Right?
Yeah.
But it's taken me, and I'm practicing still, but it's taken me some time.
Yeah, it's a process, and I believe I'm there too. I know I had a stage where it was all about pleasing people. It's all about being a nice guy, and then you get to a point where you become resentful
Yep.
and you start to act out of character, and then people wonder
Oh,
why you tripping, Quan? Why you tripping? And it's like all that all that internalized anger just builds up over time. It's cumulative.
yes.
And then one day it just comes out as something just really toxic and people are just like, okay, something's wrong with this dude. Let me just keep my distance away, right?
We have to think about it. It's like people pleasing, the way that a lot of us have been raised, at least in the US, is that people pleasing equals being a good person. And
Yes.
being a good person is the moral high ground that everyone wants to be on. Right? Like it's very apparent in a lot of our parenting practices that we have with our children, is that if I ask you to do something or I tell you to do something, the expectation is that you would do it. And when you do that, that continues to fill this marble jar of both that equals mutual respect. And then that also equals that means you're a good kid. And then in class, we do it all the time. Like, how many of us in the beginning of the year tell our learners, I want you to challenge me in classroom. I want you to tell me when I've made a mistake. I want you to tell me when I got something wrong. And these are the 3 ways that you can feel empowered to challenge me. Like, here are the 3 sentences you can say. Raise your hand. Mrs. Hawthorne, I noticed, blah, blah, blah. Mrs. Hawthorne, is right now a good time to challenge you? Right? Like, do we pre-teach that to let, first of all, the idea that mistakes belong here and that we're all going to make mistakes?
Yes.
And to also allow accountability to happen. Because that's the other thing. When I'm people pleasing, what I'm really saying is, I don't want anyone to hold me accountable. So I'm just going to do everything you want me to do. And therefore, I'm never going to receive negative, doing quotation marks, negative feedback, right? It's like, it's this never ending cycle that we have all of these systems that we've been raised in that continue to feed that. Instead, it's like, you know what? Actually, I don't want to do that math assignment. I'm going to challenge you. I don't want to do it. And I can say, well, why don't you want to do the math assignment? And they're like, because I've done it 3 times, or I already know how to do it. That's very interesting. How do I know that you know how to do that?
Right.
Like, could you maybe just pick 3 questions on the page? And if you do that successfully, then I yield to you. You're right. You don't have to do the whole sheet. Right? It's like, how do then I allow them to start to advocate for themselves at a very young age that is developmentally appropriate, instead of continue to do everything that I ask you to do. And then they never learn advocacy skills. And then we most certainly don't learn them if you have the privilege to go to college, right? That is a very top-down system of like, assignments are due. And if you don't do it, when I say and how I say, you will fail. And you're paying a lot of money. So who wants to fail at that age? No one does. And then you get into the workforce, and we still now don't know how to advocate for ourselves.
Oh, wow.
And then we have an administrator, especially if you have a top-down administrator that's like, do all of these things. And you're just like, okay, because I want to be a good person and I want to be respectful, right? Like, it's another thing. I don't want to be disrespectful. It's like, advocating for yourself is never disrespectful.
And as you're talking about this is why so many of us, real talk, have degrees, because we were good at schooling. I know I was really good at schooling. I knew when I was in college, I knew how to file directions. I knew I had to go to office hours to speak to my professors in order to finesse a grade and get them to curve that exam. You know what I mean? Like, I knew how to do that. And I'm at a place now where I'm not ashamed to say that. Was I the smartest person? No. I mean, I didn't have the highest GPA, but I knew that if I did certain things, if I just came to class every day, if I raised my hand enough to be noticed, if I showed up to these office hours enough, if I said the right buzzwords, I can at least guarantee myself a minimum grade of a 70% in pretty much practically every class I took. And that's what got me through 5 years of undergrad. And that ultimately what got me through K to 12 is because I was just a good student. I was conscientious. I cared about my learning. I tried really hard.
So many things. I have to like write myself a note, because there's so many things that it just made me think about too, like, then how ableist our systems are, because we have the ability to access social cues and the ability to understand our cultural grace and courtesies. Like, how many times is acceptable for us to raise our hand? Because there's a number, right? There's a number of like, I want the teacher to know that I'm engaged, but I also don't want to get on the teacher's nerves. And like, we can read that, and we can read the teachers. Not everybody has the ability to be able to understand cues in that way. But there's something else you just said. You were like, was I the smartest student in the class? And I say that, I've said that so many times, right? Like, I am most certainly was not the smartest kid in the class. But, you know, when you just said it, it made me think about but why wasn't I the smartest kid? And I think when you said that, what kind of floated into my mind was I wasn't the smartest kid because I knew how to, not that I knew, I'm processing right now out loud. I wasn't the smartest kid in class because I understood that I needed to limit my creativity. Right? It was like I was the smartest kid in class because I knew that compliance was valued over creativity. Because I think about, there's a couple students I remember from school, particularly middle school and high school, that when they hardly ever spoke, but when they did, it was like, watch out. Like, I just remember being like, they're so brilliant. They had terrible grades. I think one student dropped out. I don't know where they're at now in life. And they were cisgender white boys, but there's these two students I could think about just in coming to mind who were so brilliant. And they did not at all value compliance. They didn't at all like value just doing busy work to do busy work to get an A. And oftentimes, like, you would see them together in the corner crafting or creating something, drawing something. Like, they just were not on topic. Now, granted, I think that because of their racial and gender identity, they also were allowed to do that. And like, the teachers never called them disruptive or like called the school police officer on them or kicked them out, where we had Black students that happened, right? But I think about that, and it's like, I guess I learned from an early age, limit creativity and you will, quote unquote, succeed.
And that's real right here. So I want to talk about this new book coming out, Raising Anti-Racist Children. And we've been touching on a lot of these different themes that I know are in the book. But yeah, just let us know, well, first off, what brought you to write the book, Raising Anti-Racist Children? Well, I know it was co-written because there's a co-author, and I want to make sure that we shout her out. So let's get her name out there.
Yes.
And also, like, what are some of those specific resources and lessons that parents specifically can expect from the book?
Yeah, so I'm really honored and super proud of this book that both Tasha and I wrote together. And so Raising Anti-Racist Children, a practical parenting guide, is truly a practical parenting guide. We have about 15 contributing authors. I know, my friend Trisha Mokino, she's one of the contributing authors in the book. And I started off writing the book, and then later on, Tasha was originally my editor and then turned co-author, which I'm really excited about. But I started off writing the book that, as we said in the beginning of the interview, what is it that you needed? What is it that I needed when I was growing up? And I needed those skills, right? I needed the skills of how to identify oppression and discrimination, and what are the languages, like what's the accurate language around that? And then how do I actually practice that in my home in a developmentally appropriate way? And so I started writing it actually as an ebook, and I just was going kind of open source it as an ebook. And then my friend Christine, who on Instagram is Afro Minimalism, had connected me with this team of publisher to publish the book. And so when I started writing it around the chosen values I had in my household for me of what it means to be a liberatory parent and caregiver. And collaboration was one of those values. And so that's why I have so many contributing authors in the book. And I also want to challenge a lot of white supremacy characteristics, right? Of like, there's one right way to do it. Yes. What I wanted to show is that particularly families of a global majority have been practicing anti-racism for a number of years, but they maybe not have had the language to say, this is what I'm doing. But that also looks different depending on where you live and your resources and your racial and ethnic identity, and then your parenting partner's racial and ethnic identity, and then your children's racial and ethnic identity. So it's broken into 5 sections. We have defining our understanding, which kind of jumpstarts everybody on the same page. And then we go to healthy bodies, where we're really thinking and focusing on body positivity with using an anti-racist lens. Radical minds of like, how do we have those paradigm shifts with our children? We have conscious shopping, which is really exciting because we live in a capitalist society. Then we want to make sure we're also aligning our values, right, with businesses and experiences. And then we round it off with thriving communities. How do we, as we've been talking about this entire time, how do we have a community-focused, a community-centered approach to this work?
So y'all heard it. This is a book that people need to get. And is it in pre-order stage now? Is it out?
Yes. So you can pre-order it pretty much anywhere that you are going to order your books. You can pre-order it. And the book then is released on June 7th, will be the book birth date. So I'm so excited.
Ooh, it's coming around. That date's
Yes.
coming around. So, Britt, listen, I could talk to you all day. And like I said in the beginning, it's an honor to have you on this podcast. I've been admiring your work for quite a while, and I'm just excited to see how you move forward with this work, particularly with this book.
Thank you so much. It is also my honor to be on here to share space and just get a chance to chat with you more. The last time we talked, even though it was not recorded, right? It was like we could just continue and like unpack and process so many things. And that is so much about this work, is how do I find other folks that are willing to be vulnerable and unpack and process so that we can reach our fullest potential. So thank you.
Absolutely. And just real quick, usually we do a lightning round, but we're going to do a super quick lightning round.
Okay.
And I have one question, which I ask all my guests. If you can invite 3 influential figures, dead or alive, to dinner, who would they be?
My grandma Pascal, my granny Hale, and my mom.
There it is. And that's the quickest lightning round in Identity Talk history. So, how can people connect with you on social media and continue to support the work that you're doing? You could also share your website as well.
Yeah, so I will say, if you kind of want to catch me when you catch me, follow me, read along on Instagram at Britt Hawthorne. If you're looking for something a little bit more practical and structured, I have a weekend newsletter that's all about practical strategies you can subscribe to on my website, britthawthorne.com. And definitely pick up my book, Raising Anti-Racist Children, a Practical Parenting Guide.
All right.
Thank you.
Y'all heard it from Britt Hawthorne. So thank you so much for coming on, and we will definitely need to connect in the near future.
Oh, I can't wait. Thank you so much, Kwame. I appreciate you.
All right, thank you. You have a good rest of the day, Britt.
You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. All right, y'all. So we're about to end another fantastic episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I'm wishing you all a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.